Hi, and welcome to Decoding AQ, helping you to learn the tools, mindsets, and actions to thrive in an ever-changing world. Hi, and welcome to the next episode of Decoding AQ. I have Dr. Benjamin Hardy with me today. He's an organizational psychologist. He's written some amazing books, got a new one coming out called Personality Isn't Permanent. And I think coming from a history of blog writing, I think you were #1 writer in the world, or most viewed and read writer for 3 years. You have created a storm of followers for your writing concepts and insights. So it's a pleasure to have you with us, Ben.
Hey, I love your work. I love your premise. You just showed me your, your breakdown, and I'm like so on board with everything you're doing. And I love the
Nice.
rigor of it. I feel like you're isolating what really matters for learning, for letting go of things, it's just fun. It's fun to see what you're up to.
It's one of these things where you're doing something that's quite controversial and breaking up lots of myths in something that's been around for a long time. And so many people have got preconceived ideas. It's a bit like the social experiments where you have people follow something with a load of actors in, and you bring someone in, and over time you remove those actors doing that behavior and see if they still do it. And they've no idea in the connection to why they're doing it. So I see that as kind of personality tests as current, is that people don't have any real idea of why they're doing it or that they're rigorous. It's just because it was done before, but they've lost the connection to maybe the history and those things. But
Yeah.
there we go. The image that we shared is our adaptiotic table. As a geeky nerd that enjoys science and the periodic table, we have our own view of what adaptability is, and it has all of these different dimensions. So I just shared that with you, and it's kind words. So why don't we start off with just a little bit of what did you get into writing? What drove you into that kind of area for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's so fun, by the way, to look at your periodic table. There's various aspects of that thing that like I immediately zoomed in on, which,
Nice.
but anyways, yeah, I got into writing actually when I was serving a church mission. So I grew up in a very traumatic, chaotic environment and did learn how to adapt. In that terrible situation, my father became a drug addict when I was an 11-year-old boy. And basically, I had zero stability or support essentially from age 11 to 19. And so I really don't know how I graduated from high school. And basically, the environment decayed. And I was kind of reaching that state of meaninglessness or hopelessness to my life, which is often the case with just trauma or just chaotic environments. And so I was reaching a point of unhappiness. I'm a believer in what Gordon Livingston said. Gordon Livingston's a famous psychiatrist. He wrote a book called Too Soon Old, Too Late Smart. But he talks about how happiness requires something to do, someone to love, and something to look forward to. And I didn't really have to look forward to. And Viktor Frankl pretty much said the same thing as far as the Holocaust. As soon as people stopped having something to look forward to, the present became very meaningless. So for me, I was looking for that at age 19. I was living at my cousin's house doing nothing, playing World of Warcraft all day. And so I decided to connect back with my faith, served a church mission. And while I was there kind of exposing myself to all sorts of new things, I was in a new role, had a new purpose, new identity, doing all sorts of cool community service, reading tons of books and journaling. It was through this process of journaling a lot and reading lots of books and actually just going through new experiences that I learned how to write in a stream of consciousness way, and was just mostly detailing my experiences and my thoughts, but I was learning more while writing because I was integrating. I think that journal writing is one of the most fine forms of integration, which is obviously a key aspect of learning. Just writing about what you're doing and then obviously connecting it into your memory web.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was, it taught me a lot. It made me a much more effective missionary and leader. And so I just fell in love with that. And I just decided that I wanted to write when I came home from that experience. And
I'm,
so, yeah,
I'm
that's really
fascinated
what got me
by
into it.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by journalers, and I'm always intrigued as to the method that people use and some of the
Yeah,
tools people use. Are you a old school pen and paper
definitely.
doodler, journaler? You are?
Yeah, definitely. I don't doodle as much, although
Okay.
I do like have bullet points, sometimes pictures. Like I'll do a bunch of mind maps if I'm really
Yep.
trying to like understand or organize an idea. But yeah, mostly it's just bullet points and just paragraphs, just sketchy. I don't have like the 5-minute journal. I just,
Yeah.
I'm actually on top of several of my journals right here. I mean, it's very ugly, it's just like, just pen and
Cool.
paper, there's nothing fancy about it, but it's just a place to write about your thinking, your thoughts, your feelings, the ideas that come in, and starting to organize them, and even organizing your emotions, which I think from an emotional regulation standpoint, just people just don't spend the time doing. So they're more chaotic in their head than they need to be.
I like looking at people's journals. It is cool to share. And we're both members of Strategic Coach.
Sure.
And I find it fascinating, to look at different people. And you have someone like Dean Jackson, for example, who, he uses the, what's it called now? The like electronic ink page. Can't think of the word at the moment of what it is, but it's like a very dumbed down iPad. And he just likes doing it as the texture of there. And you have Joe Polish, who, writes a lot in his notebooks and things. And the whole premise of it is thinking about your thinking when you go to coach, and that in itself is a form of journaling. And you get your workshop boxes to fill out and all of these things, and it becomes a skill of that, being able to think and reflect and plan. That I certainly am very grateful for learning that skill and becoming part of my future life.
Yeah, I kind of, I read the book when I was younger called As a Man Thinketh. Have you ever read that one?
No.
Oh, it's an old book written like 100
Okay.
years ago by a guy named James Allen, but he compares the mind to a garden, something that can either just be filled with weeds or something that you can be the tiller of, and you can plant things and then they can grow. And just about how what you focus your thinking on becomes your character, your external circumstances, etc. And so why I like what you're talking about with coach is that from my perspective, it's a way for the gardener of the garden, which is our mind, and we're the gardener, to like go and look at the garden, to refine the garden, to till it, to plant seeds,
Nice.
in the form of dance tools. And then it's begin to, grow as, from a subconscious perspective. And so I just think, I like that analogy of just, a lot of people's minds, they haven't really spent that much time thinking about their thinking. They don't even know that their garden is overrun and bogged down, which is leading to, terrible external circumstances.
If we are what we eat, we certainly are what we think.
Bigly. Yeah. Huge.
So in terms of your book that is, depending on when this gets released, it's either just about coming out or it's out, more likely that it's out. And, I was very intrigued by your very personal story at the beginning, where a personality test could have affected your own life quite negatively. Do you want to share just a little glimpse into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was an undergrad studying psychology, I dated all sorts of girls. I was, I had served that church mission and I was ready to get married, move on. I'd done a lot of therapy as well. Honestly, better understanding kind of the emotional impact of my parents' divorce and traumatic background. And by the way, just for listeners to know, while I was serving that church mission, which was from age 20 to 22, my father actually did overcome almost all of his addictions. And he and I are just great friends. I mean, he's in a very great place. I like the Dan Sullivan concept, measure the gain, not the gap.
Yeah.
And
Definitely
from that perspective, my father's actually a hero of mine. And that's actually how I've chosen to frame my full past. And that's actually a key, is that you get to decide the meaning of former experiences and present experiences. And I actually think that's a huge aspect of adaptability, is meaning making and choosing positive meanings so that you're not tied to whatever it was. But kind of back to the story. So I dated a lot of girls, but when I first saw Lauren, who's the girl I now married, I was like totally just attracted to her. I was like, holy cow, if I married that girl, because I was in one of her classes and I just heard some of her comments and I was just watching her and I was just totally immediately attracted. And I was just like, if I married that girl, my future self is going to be amazing. That was the insight. And also I just felt like yeah, it took a while for us to start dating. And then there was a popular personality test at the time, which was called the color code. And it was a test that she liked, her family liked, and it was just kind of trendy around the area that we went to school. And so, I took the test, got a score. And when I got the score, it was kind of a little bit, it confused her and her family. Let's just say that.
Okay.
And it made them wonder why Lauren would be interested in someone like me. because she comes from a family that's, fairly successful, like, as far as, just they're really just like kind of an intense, but really just successful in general family, really well put together. The whole family is very healthy emotionally and also just financially. And they've got like their own beliefs. But anyways, the reason it was concerning to them is because the color code breaks people into 4 types. One being, they call them red, blue, white, and yellows, just to make people seem fancy, I guess. But the reds are your driven type A people, which is kind of how they viewed Lauren. And that's generally how they even viewed their whole family, was that they were a red family. We're very driven, very purposeful. Mm-hmm. Blues are more heart-centered, more just relationship-based. Whites are more introspective, passive, aloof often, but peaceful. And then yellows are extroverted, party people, life of the, center of the party. Well, I, according to the color code at the time, was a white. At least that's what I mostly measured out as. Mm-hmm. And Lauren obviously was a red. And that was the reason they were so concerned, is because from that perspective, I was a very passive, aloof guy. Whites, according to the color code, aren't goal-driven. They're not goal-oriented, really. They're just dreamers who don't really do much. And so, and I think thinking back on why I would have scaled that way is because definitely at the time, and even still now, I'm very much into abstract thinking, but there's many more aspects of me. Mm-hmm. But the bigger concern from them is that Lauren had been married before. She was in a prior marriage, and she got married at 19 and was married to a guy who was a red according to the color code. So he was very driven, type A, and he happened to also be a jerk, and so he was a very abusive guy, abused her in all forms for 3 years. Lauren becomes a shell of herself. Luckily, she gets out of that situation and travels for a few years to kind of reinvent herself. Mm-hmm. And so multiple years after the divorce, I'm the first guy she seriously dates. And so when her parents find out I'm a white, they're like, okay, like, we see what Lauren's up to. She's dating this passive guy so that she's never manipulated and controlled again. And although that's all well and good, you still need to marry a real man. Like, you need to marry a guy who is going to get somewhere in life. And so, Lauren, you probably shouldn't date this white. Yeah, you don't take this guy seriously. Like, he's a nice guy, but you shouldn't make a decision out of fear. And marrying a white would be making a decision out of fear. That was their opinion.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How you talked earlier, just a moment ago, about being in control of the meaning of something. And
it's big, man.
Yeah, that's big.
We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are.
Exactly. And we can do that because someone near us or close to us has that same viewpoint. And, the piece about, we're the sum of the 5 people we spend the most time with, and we find that really interesting in adaptability, in that if you take somebody into a different context, a different team or different environment, so many things are going to shift, from their personality to their character to all of the
their
aspects,
thinking patterns, to their emotions.
Thinking patterns. Are they supported? Are they going to be experimental? Are they going to be former of their shells? And so we are these very morphable entities,
contextual beings.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I find that even with high intelligence people aren't able to maybe break free to that way of thinking. It's a bit like a comment Nick Nanton made on our very first Free Zone Frontier group at Coach. And it was the end of the day and the end of the session. And I'm sure it's probably from lots of places, but the setting was perfect for it. And it was, we can't unsee what we've just experienced. And when you discover and have something for that first time that redefines a viewpoint, you can't then unsee it. You can't, you can maybe choose to try and push it away or whatever, but it's seen. And I see a lot of what your work is doing is going to give people new eyes to see things in an entirely new way. And that is freeing, incredibly freeing work. So I think humanity is going to thank you very much for a lot of the work, and there's one thing, academic and science, and then there's the other, the real world. How do you feel the difference is that even if you can prove something and you can show, here's the evidence, here's the science, in the real world of where people in their echo chambers, they only want to look for things that, align to what they believe in. How do you think this is going to be found where it's a huge economy? And you are saying lots of this is debunked, lots of these are myths, lots of these are actually harmful, and it's an economy.
Well, you can
What's
tell why
do you
they're
think's
harmful
going to
from.
happen?
Yeah, I believe. I hope that I stoke the pot. You know what I mean? I'm poking the bear essentially,
Yep.
and obviously I'm gonna get a lot of backlash. I mean, I've written articles,
Mm-hmm.
like, for example, on Myers-Briggs is one example. On every time I write an article on these types of profiling tests, DISC, etc., I get all sorts of extreme backlash, because of what we were talking about before we jumped on, is when someone has made something sacred to their identity, then they seek to defend it against criticism. And when someone's taken these types of tests seriously and they've adopted the label, which now has become a part of themselves, they're seeking to confirm that bias rather than disconfirm it, right? And so it is a big economy. A lot of people attach their identity to these tests. And, I'm just hoping to provide perspectives as far as why they're so limiting. One of the core reasons I believe these things are really limiting is because of what they do to your identity. They really turn it into, from a psychological perspective, and kind of going back to what you were talking about with adaptability, being from an environment to environment, what these tests often do is they'll give you a single score, right? You'll get a label, but that label has no reference to context. It's purely focused on content. And so it's like, you're an X, I'm a white, as an example. But that doesn't tell me in what contexts I would be a white. It just, you assume content matters more than context, which is actually
Mm-hmm.
the opposite. Context matters way more than content. And context determines the meaning of content. And so these tests ignore that. And so people become very mindless to the many, many times throughout a given day when they're actually not living according to their label. But, labels become tunnel vision. As we said, you see the world as it is, not as you are. And so you see the world selectively, selective attention. But my big thought for you, as you're talking about this, and what I love about your work, we actually call it psychological flexibility. According to your model, you called it mental flexibility, which has a lot to do with imagination.
Yep.
But psychological flexibility is essential to jumping from environment to environment and not being so held to the ideas of the former context, but being able to, pattern recognition, mindfulness being so important. And so one of the reasons why you'd want to hold your current identity more loosely rather than being so defined by who you think you are, but being more adaptive, is that it allows you to be mindful.
Yep.
Ellen Langer, who's a Harvard psychologist, she's been studying mindfulness for 40 years. She says one of the biggest things that stops people from being mindful is the labels that they've identified with, because you then begin to only see the world through the label, but also you become very mentally inflexible to anything that seems outside of the label. So you're like, if I'm an introvert, as an example, then being in a social situation is not something I can do. So you would be pretty non-adaptive in that environment if you've held to that identity. So I think it's very interesting what these things can do to not only your perspective, but to your learning ability.
And some of it, has been designed to protect us. And at certain points, something that protected us was great. But if the context changes, it can be what then limits us. It's where a springboard morphs into the ball and chain. A product and service
That's a really good insight.
that allowed us to grow suddenly becomes the very thing that holds us back. And I think that's the challenge that many organizations are facing, is that they've had applause, they've had success. It's not completely failed and wrong. It's not burnt. And they then got no choice but to comply and come up with something else. It's those sneaky ones that are giving a level of success and reward, but they don't know what's just around the corner if they deshackle themselves from it. And that's where disruption comes from, right? Of those kinds of concepts and thinking. And it is hard to disrupt ourselves. And when
You
it's
kind
not
of have to know what's coming, not only for you, but for the context. You know what I mean? And
yeah.
you've got to not be so clinged. I mean, what Dan says is that growth should always be more important than status, right?
Yep.
But I think what you're talking about is often status, that something was happening in the past, therefore you keep doing it. Like a lot of people wondered why I stopped writing on medium.com for so long. And I'm like, well, that got me here, but it's definitely not going to get me to my new goals. Yep. My future self has different goals than my former self, and it has to therefore have a different process. So I'm not going to just keep doing something because it didn't work, because it worked in the past,
And it's one thing to say thank you for that in the past and acknowledge it and move forward. It's another thing to be vulnerable and confident and courageous enough to say, actually, that was wrong. I need to change now. And what came to my head in the story when you were talking was, I think it's discussed in Black Box Thinking, and it's about the concept of judges and people going to prison pre and post DNA being used. It was like 1984, DNA is used. If DNA is, present on the gun that did it, then, that's the deal breaker that you're being committed. Now, there's a load of people who went to jail before DNA testing was, possible, that are now proven that they should be free. But the system of the judges and everything has to accept that it was wrong. But the issue is it wasn't wrong. They made the right decision with the data they had at the time.
Sure.
Now there's new data, but what they feel is that that erodes their position and identity, that they are right all the time. And I think that's a real interesting challenge.
So this brings up such a crazy cool concept that really, I love where your thinking goes. So what's interesting is there's a quote that I have at the beginning of the book. The quote is that a painting is never finished. It simply ends in an interesting place. And so just as one example, and there's also a lot of research, and I'd point your listeners to Daniel Gilbert. He's a Harvard psychologist. He has a TED Talk called The Psychology of Your Future Self. But essentially the idea is this, kind of pulling these ideas together. A painting is never finished. You should look at your former self as a different person. Like, for example, you 3, 5, 10 years ago, most people actually, if asked, do you think you're the same person you were 10 years ago, will say no. And so kind of looking at what you were just saying, just as one example, I recently reread Willpower Doesn't Work. I re-listened to the audiobook because I've gone through a lot as a human being. I wrote that book over 3 years ago. Since then, finished a PhD, adopted kids, done all sorts of crazy stuff, written a few books, gone through a lot of mentoring. I don't see the world exactly the same way. And so I re-listened to it. And for one, I was very critical of the writing style. I think that there's a lot of good writing in there and stuff. But I was like, holy cow. It's kind of that quote from Elaine de Button that if you're not embarrassed by who you were 12 months ago, you didn't learn enough. But one aspect of all this is to not actually be angry at your former self, because exactly what you're saying. It's kind of the gain in the gap perspective again. To see the gains, I was like, wow, because Willpower Doesn't Work was never finished. It was just done at some point. I had to end it at an interesting place so that I could move on. And so when I look back on it, I'm like, I'm not the same guy who wrote that book. And the Benjamin Hardy now, who has the data I have now, the mindsets, the knowledge, experience, and even the priorities, which are very different from my former self's priorities, I wouldn't have written that book today. But I'm not mad at my former self for having written it. I can just see, and my future self is going to be saying the same thing about the books I'm writing right now. My future self is going to look with new data, with fresh eyes, with a fresh identity at even the book we're talking about today. And I'm going to see many flaws and perspectives. And I think this brings up two things. One is that you shouldn't hold your current identity so tightly, which is what people do when they strongly and definitively label themselves, is that your current identity is very temporary. So Carol Dweck with the fixed mindset versus growth mindset says that people with the fixed mindset are defined by who they are today. If they fail, it means that that's their cap. Whereas growth mindset, they're not defined by who they are today. She says they get to luxuriate in the power of yet. They're not there yet. And so I think that what's cool about what you're saying is, and I think it takes a lot of humility and courage, is to say, I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And I was wrong,
today.
But I don't blame my former self for those decisions. And I've got a lot of empathy and love for my former self, but I don't need to do things the same way. And I can admit now from my new eyes that that's not the meaning I would give to those former experiences, nor the action I would take now.
I think that's critical. It's not the action I would take now. I'm grateful I took the action that I did before.
Sure.
But now I have new insight.
Therefore I shouldn't do the same. Therefore I shouldn't do things the same way.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And yes, it takes courage, it takes bravery, it takes these things, and to learn is to be vulnerable, to say, I don't know the answer. Knowledge is the opposite.
Dan Sullivan says all progress starts by telling the truth.
Yeah.
And I
mean, I love all of these great quotes, and it's the context of when a quote resonates with somebody, and then what meaning do they have it? It's like a Lego serious play. I went on the couples connection that Coach does. If you haven't done it, it's amazing. And the context was around Lego serious play. For those who haven't done it, you make an object that's inert that you then describe the meaning to it. And we had to create a little model of what our goals were for a year's time as a couple. So you had all these, there was like 40 couples, 80 people in a room, all playing with Lego, creating these things. And then you describe what that is, and we're describing, oh, that's our garden, and these are all the animals we've rescued, and this is all the veg that we grow, and all the various things. But I mean, to someone looking at it, it's just a few blocks of colored Lego within there. So when we look at, there's a couple of things I wanted to dive into in terms of, you mentioned it, this future self, and you talk about in your book a conversation with your future self. And I had flashes in my brain of a couple of bits. One was I think it was a Matthew McConaughey old talk he gave at a university about heroes.
It was actually his 2018
was it
Academy Award speech. It was his speech during the 2018 Academy Award victory. You can watch it on YouTube.
Is it? I got a feeling
he might have given an old version of the same talk.
Yeah, I think he did because it looked a lot older. And it was basically a bit like, you mentioned your father is a hero of yours. And what Matthew talks about is one of his heroes is his future self. And that is a beautiful, when you think about it, and if you're in the right moment in your own chapter to understand what that could mean for you, that resonated about the conversation with your future self. So tell us a little bit more about your thinking behind that and some of the concepts in the book about having conversations with your future self.
Yeah, I really don't know if there's anyone you can get better advice from. But big aspect of this is to view your future self as a different person. So there's a lot of research from Hal Hershfield, who's at UCLA, and he's studied this. And it's really helpful to not think that your future self is the same person you are today. Because as we've already talked about, they're going to be in a different context. They're going to have different data and information. And they're probably going to have even gone through lots of experiences, good and bad, that will shift potentially their priorities or perspectives. And so your future self is a different person. They may be focused on even different things or be in a different stage of their development. And so rather than assuming them to be who you are today, and even that they would think the same thoughts you would think, it's actually better to say they're a different person. They've got different preferences and perspectives. And then to start to make decisions based on the preferences. Obviously, first you would need to think about who you want that person to be. And that's a really good key point is that it's who you want them to be. Your future self isn't someone you discover. It's something you decide about your future. The more confidence you develop as a person and even flexibility, the more agency you have to make choices and decisions. And so you would think about, who is this person? Who do I want to be? What are the circumstances I want to have? What are the things I want to be focused on? And then you would, start to think about it's actually very difficult, if not impossible, to make intentional decisions today without a future self in mind. You can't really be intentional without having a direction.
It becomes
so your
filter.
Future. Yeah. The future self is the filter
Yep.
of what you do today. Without having that, you have no context for making choices today. And therefore you would just make decisions based on emotional preferences or circumstantial preferences, or pressures. And so basically from a decision-making standpoint, you need to have a future self in mind so that you can actually know what to do today that would be directed or curated in that direction. Also from a learning perspective, the concept of deliberate practice. There's a lot of research, on deliberate practice being the way you develop expertise. You can't actually have focused, curated process without a specific outcome in mind. Yeah. And so
it kind of
you
links
can't do that.
A little bit to our view of grit, in terms of
grit's big.
A future self is about, a passion and perseverance over the long term. Very different to what, some people confuse always grit the same as resilience and all of these bits. And of course, people who study or scientists can understand the differences, but for most people who can't even understand or see that Myers-Briggs is, not a good thing to be doing anymore. It might
never
be hard,
really was, but yeah,
no, never was. It is in terms of that future self. I had a conversation with somebody once about how would you behave in different situations? What would you do? And the scenarios we had around the dinner table was, okay, so you've lost your job. What's different? What's the same? So if you live in the same town, you have the same family, same relationships, all of those things, what would you do in the next day? What would you do in the first 100 days? And we then changed the setting and scenario to say, if you move to a different postcode or a different country, now what would you do? in that day, the first 100 days, and those sorts of things. And was about, and it was an experiment to look at how much of what is around you is a support or a hindrance, and
I
how much
saw
could
that
you
on your
then,
model. Looks
yeah,
really good. I
how could you reimagine and give yourself a permission to be somebody different if they didn't know who you were before? And whereas everyone that's close to us knows who we were yesterday. And therefore, we want to take them along on our journey for our future self. So they can either be the cheerleaders or they can be the ball and chain. So it's so important to select really carefully when we have our future self defined, who is going to inhibit or who is going to accelerate our journey towards that, because it's hard work. We can't do it alone. With whatever practice, whatever things there are, we need the cheerleaders for the cheerleader of our future vision of ourselves. So that's why we have to communicate it.
Exactly.
And so all of these concepts are so wonderful and so freeing about we can
If you don't
begin each
communicate it, you're
day
never going
new.
to actually be able to build the environment around it, right?
Yes.
You're still actually too ashamed to share it. And there's
Yeah.
actually a quote that you're as sick as your secrets. That's an Alcoholics Anonymous quote. Yeah, Dan
Interesting.
actually has another quote. He says, surround yourself with people who remind you more of your future than your past.
I
And
love
actually,
that.
the goal of all of this is that your future self is the thing driving your daily behavior versus your former self being the thing, or maybe even you on autopilot being the thing driving your daily behavior. But I think many people's identity narrative is so rooted in their former self, or even so definitive on the labels of today, that their behavior today is a reflection of their behavior yesterday versus their behavior today being a reflection of tomorrow. And that's
Yeah.
actually the goal, is that your future self is the thing predicting not only your identity narrative, but also your behavior, your actions, your support environment. Then you're going to be driving forward and having lots of peak learning experiences. And you're going to be developing a lot of confidence and flexibility.
I've got a quick story of, in fact, a family member of mine that I have been just constantly amazed. I met my wife just over 15 years ago. She has 2 grown-up sons. We now have 5 grandchildren. And one of her sons was going through a very challenging time in his life early in our relationship and with his mum. And he, um, had his demons. And what was very interesting, and I'll keep the story short, is that he made a decision about who he wanted to be in the future and recognized that he had to shift a few things. And some of that was environment.
Big.
And it's one thing saying, okay, those friends are no good for me. We're reds, you're whites, whatever it may be, they're no good for me. Right. They're taking me down the wrong paths, and to avoid them or to say, I'm not going to spend any time with them. What I was just tremendously amazed by is he went and had conversations with those people and told them why he was making a decision not to be around them anymore. How brave is that when you're at a point of high vulnerability, lowness of confidence, of all of these things, to go and face some of those people that you've grown up with that's shaped who he was, to then say, I want to be somebody new, and I want to let you know this is why I'm not going to be spending time with you. I don't want you to be somebody different. I just wanted to say, thank you for what is past, but now I'm going somewhere new.
I think
And I
that's a
went,
brilliant
wow.
example of all progress starts by telling the truth. But it's also an example of a Tim Ferriss quote where he said that, your success in life is often determined by the amount of awkward conversations you're willing to have, or and like, I think that that's a truthful and honest way to show respect to those relationships that mattered so much. It's the whole "what got you here won't get you there" concept. But I just think that those friends deserve that
100%.
conversation. And they don't deserve you just to shun them or to disappear. They deserve an explanation. And for you to say, look, I've loved everything that's brought us here. I have this new direction. And so I need to go and figure things out, which is going to require the relationship to change, because my future is now requiring me to do this because I'm really excited and committed to this. So I just want to thank you for what we've gotten. Who knows if our paths will cross in the future? I think that that's a healthy, powerful, honest way to do something. It does take courage, but yeah.
It takes courage. And without wanting listeners or people to maybe end up in padded cells or talking to themselves in the mirror, I wonder how much of this could be so valuable in thinking about us and this concept of it's a different. It's a different person who we were in our past and a different person in the future. And going and having a conversation with the person in the past and thanking them, you know,
I
and
actually
those things.
encourage the conversation of what would your future self say to your former self? You know, especially the broken version, maybe in your most
Yep.
traumatic experiences. And usually it would be incredible love, incredible, empathy and support and encouragement. And just to say, look, you've done amazing. You've got a great future ahead of you. You're not broken. You're not hopeless. I mean, one of the big things about grit is honestly hope. You know, like you have to have hope. That's what,
Hope
again, what
is
Frankl said. Frankl
really
said
big.
those who adapted in the concentration camps had hope for their future. Otherwise, the moment you lose hope, everything goes down.
It does. And one of our concepts of, you know, what we're doing to make sure no one's left behind. And Keith Ferrazzi talks about the concept of co-elevation. And, you know, as long as everyone has a better tomorrow than today in their mind, that's hope. You know, and how do you cultivate that? It comes back to your garden of the mind, is that feed hope. And that can come sometimes from the right people you choose to be around. I'd like to touch on one bit before we end and wrap up, because I could have conversation with you for days.
We might have to do a round two.
Yeah, maybe. But I want to talk about an article that you posted quite recently, and it was about another great provocative title of "Personality is a Skill," and you talked about a body of work where it was looking at one dimension, one area of personality, a sort of character trait of conscientiousness, and how over a very short period that could be shifted. So just tell us a little bit more about that, and this idea of how can we reframe and reimagine personality as a skill and something that, like you say, you actually shape and you can control and define through action. So just share a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, from a psychological standpoint, kind of the dominant theory is what's called the big five. And you and I have talked about that. Not all of these dimensions predict adaptability success without question. But what's good about the big five, at least as a structure, is that rather than giving you a type, what you get is a score on a percentile rank. So you'll get a percentile rank versus the majority of the population on, for example, extroversion or conscientiousness, which is basically organization and learning. Or openness to experience. You get a score on a percentile rank, and most people are going to be somewhere in the middle of the bell curve. To be honest with you, I'm pretty in the middle on most of them. Imagination, I'm a little higher than normal, but I've got a pretty average personality, to be fully honest with you, when it comes to the big five. Obviously, I've got knowledge and environments and goals and purpose that are radically different, and confidence, which wouldn't be measured in there, that you can't scale. But the reason why this study was cool is it just showed that there was a 2-week purposeful intervention that people could do as far as practicing, as far as deliberate practicing certain skills, in a certain way, becoming a little bit more organized or more self-directed to become more conscientiousness, or opening yourself up to new experiences, trying new things, and just showing that you can actually increase your percentile rank according to the norm. You might be in the 50th percentile, you might be very average. And after a 2-week purposeful intervention or training, you could pop up to maybe 55 or 60% on, and just shows that you can become more conscientious. You can become more extroverted if you want. You can become more emotionally, stable or more imaginative. These are just skills that you can direct your attention towards and then go through purposeful learning or interventions or practice to get better at. And so rather than saying that this is where I'm at and this is where I'm at, it's better to have a growth mindset where you say, this is who I am today, but that has nothing to do with who I'm going to be in the future. And it's also not who I've been in the past. And it has a lot to do with context and many other things.
It's a bit like, when we talk about our concept of adaptability, to many people that are in it's categories and types, we use the analogy of weight and a weighing scale. And, you can stand on the scales and the needle tells you where you are. That is not the story other than that moment. And you start to learn about nutrition or exercise and context.
That context.
So, it might be good or bad. It depends what you're trying to do or achieve,
Exactly.
And for each person, each scenario, are you 2 years old? Are you 20 years old? Are you wanting to do X or Y as your goal? Then the needle and where it sits on that scale is totally relevant. And the other
thing is relevant to your goal. It's all relevant to your goal.
100%, 100%. And the other thing that I, for many years, have actively pursued is firsts.
Yep.
And what have I done
I go big on that in the
today
book.
for the first time? You know, and we lose it because things become familiar with
Routine.
time, with
Yep.
routine and time. And also our desire, you know, our igniting that muscle and that thing of firsts. If everyone around us is not doing those things and encouraging us in the way that we were when we were playful children, it kind of doesn't happen. So there's loads of bits. I remember, you know, last year I turned 40, and somebody bought me, you know, 40 things to do when you're 40, and they're little cards and they come out, you know, and I have a look at those things, and I try to look at them with the eyes of how might I change what's in there if I've done it before, to do it in a way that makes it a first. You know, in terms of I might do it with someone else or in this way or what, or it might just genuinely be something that I haven't done before. And that builds up this confidence and capability. It comes back to, you know, Dan's 4Cs model, you know, of you need a commitment first, then the courage, then the capability, and then the confidence. I see firsts as the same sort of thing, so that we can build that muscle to adapt a future that is within our control, and for others. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would have loved I did?
No, I loved this conversation. I think we could go deeper again in around 2 or 3. And just thank you for a fun conversation. I do love talking to you. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's completely mutual. I am in awe of the work that you do. You know, my skill has never been writing. My skill has always been talking. You know, that's something I love to do, is to listen and have conversations. That's my juice. That gives me energy. And I look forward to building a deeper relationship and co-elevating our works together. So it's been a real pleasure. And if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way, or the best place to get hold of your books and things like that?
Yeah, so I would encourage people to buy the book anywhere they want: Amazon,
Cool.
Kindle, wherever you want to buy books, Audible, for example. Then you go to benjaminhardy.com. That's my website, benjaminhardy.com. If you plug in your information, you can get several free online courses that take you deeper into the book. There's about 150 journal prompts throughout the book. There's a course I have on journaling, which teaches you how to elevate your subconscious. There's even blogging courses that I give away. I give away a lot of stuff for free for people who buy the book. And also all my blog posts are at benjaminhardy.com. So just check out benjaminhardy.com. Get Personality Isn't Permanent and become more adaptable.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, brother. Thank you.
Do you have the level of adaptability to survive and thrive the rapid changes ahead? Has your resilience got more comeback than a yo-yo? Do you have the ability to unlearn in order to reskill, upskill and break through? Find out today and uncover your adaptability profile and score, your AQ. Visit aqai.io to gain your personalized report across 15 scientifically validated dimensions of adaptability. For a limited time, enter code PODCAST65 for a complimentary AQ-Me assessment. AQAI, transforming the way people, teams, and organizations navigate change. Thank you for listening to this episode of Decoding AQ. Please make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast directory, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Please do leave a review, and be sure to tune in next time for more insights from our amazing guests.